But much more interestingly, this is Dr. Natasha Warikoo, and she'll be our speaker for today. So Dr. Warikoo started off her academic adventure at Brown University in Rhode Island, where she studied math and philosophy, which none of us here, well, at least none of the TAM students, I believe, have studied. It's quite different from our course of study. And after university, she entered a fellowship called Teachers for Tomorrow, and that's actually not around anymore, but it's sort of how she got her foot in the education world. And she did a one-year fellowship at a middle school. And she realized, you know what, I need to go back and I need to get a bit more education. So she went to the Harvard School of Education, where she got her master's in education. And after her time at Harvard, she went back into the classroom into New York City, where she taught at a New York City high school for immigrants. She taught 4 years secondary math. And I know from teaching science, really, math teachers they're absolutely doing the Lord's work. It's like teaching math, in my opinion, is the most fabulous thing that anyone could do, anyone could give to our country. Because students are really falling behind in math, and math teachers are just really rare. In fact, the school that I taught in, we had, I think, 2 vacancies in math. So anyone who teaches math voluntarily is, A-okay in my book. And so after that, she wanted a bit more of an academic challenge. So she went back to Harvard, got her doctorate in sociology, and then from there went to teach at the University of London for 4 years, where she taught American Studies, which is very interesting. From there, got her dream job, that she told me, at the Harvard School of Education, where she's been teaching since 2009. Dr. Warikoo has published 2 books, The Balancing Act, Youth Culture in the Global City, which I found to be very interesting, but it's not what we're going to be talking about today. Today we're going to be talking about the diversity bargain, which Dr. Warikoo will tell you more about. And just a little bit about her. She has 3 kids and 0 spare time, but the little bit of time she has, she's spending with us today. And so her kids are 2 girls and 1 boy, aged 4, 7, and 10. So I'm very grateful that Dr. Warikoo is spending a little bit of her spare time with us today, and I'll pass it over to her.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. Maybe I should stand up because I can't really use my teacher voice today because I have no voice. I have a little bit of a sore throat. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm really delighted to be here. I'm going to talk to you about my book, The Diversity Bargain and Other Dilemmas of Race, Admissions, and Meritocracy at Elite Universities. A very long title. It took a lot of negotiation with the publisher, but I have to show you because I just got these in the mail today. I got the cover. I didn't get the book yet. It's empty. They sent me the cover, and they promised me the book next week. So I'm really excited about this. And the book is about students at elite universities in the United States and Britain and how they think about race, meritocracy, and inequality. And it's really about kind of how they reconcile their own achievements with what we know about inequality. And so, and I'll say, obviously, I'm going to talk about some of the findings in that, and it's a comparison between students in the United States and students in Britain. And so I interviewed students at Oxford in Britain, and at Brown University and Harvard University in the United States. So 3 kind of very, very elite universities. And I think in some ways, what makes this project perhaps different, but I actually haven't seen what the other talks have been, but in European studies, we tend to look at a kind of macro, high level, comparing lots of different countries with a lot of, large data sets. And this is a really kind of micro look at on the ground. How are students making sense of their own lives? So a different kind of take than perhaps you tend to see in European studies. But I think in some ways it's important to understand how these high-level policies get kind of understood by people kind of on the ground who are sort of affected by those policies. So that's sort of how to kind of think about this project. So let me start out by, Okay. Let me start out by just saying that Britain and the United States are highly unequal, unusually unequal societies, especially among OECD countries. So if you look at this graph, this is just looking at the showing that there's a relationship between inequality in income and intergenerational mobility. So I'll just walk you through this. So the horizontal axis is what we call the Gini Coefficient. That is the relationship between what kind of wealthy people earn in income and what kind of the working poor earns in income, right? So the bigger the gap, the more unequal your society. And you can see the United States and Britain higher than all the other OECD countries, only topped by kind of emerging economies in terms of that measure of inequality. And then the vertical axis over here is what we call intergenerational earning elasticity. That's just the relationship between what a person earns and what their parents earn. So if, for example, if my parents are wealthy, how likely is it that I'm going to be wealthy? You can see United States and Britain higher than, again, the other OECD countries, right? And if my parents are poor, how likely is it I'm more likely to be poor in these two countries? So unequal societies and that inequality is passed along over generations, more so than comparable countries. This is also true by race. This is in the United States. If we think of, those were measures of income, we can also think of measuring wealth. That is, our assets, savings, and these get passed, unlike income, these get passed down over generations. So even if a family might have a high income, if it's the first generation out of poverty, won't have the same wealth as a family that's been wealthy for generations. So white net worth, that's the average amount of assets that white families have in the United States, is 13 times greater than that of the average black family in the United States, and 10 times greater than the average Latino family. So inequality by race, pretty dramatic inequality by race as well. We also see racial inequality in the UK in terms of unemployment rates, job status, housing, homicide, and so we see these inequalities. This exists in Britain as well. And so I wanted to know, again, how do elites make sense of their position when they are living in a highly unequal society? And how do we reconcile? How do elites reconcile beliefs in kind of equal opportunity, and that we think in the United States we think of kind of the American dream. In Britain as well, there's a real kind of sense of that there are fair chances with these outcomes that are reported in the newspaper, are kind of well known. And I thought this would give us clues as to how leaders make decisions about that kind of reproduce inequality, right? In terms of social policies, in terms of salaries, etc. And how we might think about shifting the way we think about and talk about race, class, and achievement in ways that more accurately reflect our opportunity structure and our racial realities. And I decided to look on elite campuses because in some ways elite universities are places where many elites kind of come of age, even if they weren't elite before they entered those institutions. So how they understand these kind of, how they understand merit and fairness matters a lot. They're going to go on and make decisions, and as they go on into the job market, that are going to affect, again, these measures of inequality that we saw earlier. And I also remembered my own kind of college experience where students came from a lot of different backgrounds. I went to Brown University, as was mentioned, and came together, and we were in this diverse environment talking a lot about race and difference across lines of difference, and there was a kind of expectation that we would do this. And I also noticed that in Britain, where I taught for 4 years, that didn't exist, right? That sort of kind of understanding that here we are in this diverse campus and we're going to engage in these difficult conversations, that just wasn't the expectation there. And it's not that it was class in Britain versus race in the United States. There wasn't a class kind of component to that either, right? In fact, if anything, I got the sense that students coming from more working class backgrounds really tried to hide that identity, and even kind of changing the way they spoke, because accent is often a marker of class in Britain. So I was kind of curious about how these two countries kind of how these different college experiences shape students' belief systems and understandings of race and equity in different ways. So, we can think of the U.S. and Britain as similar in terms of levels of inequality, also in terms of identifying as multicultural societies, albeit flawed multicultural societies, with a big and growing backlash right now. But with very different approaches to diversity and race, especially in elite higher education. And I'll speak later also about how they think about elite higher education is also quite different. In the book I also, how do elites make sense of their accomplishments in an unequal society and race and racial inequality in particular? And how do their national and university contexts shape that meaning making? In the book, I compare students at Harvard and Brown, and I'm not going to talk about that today. But these are two obviously similar universities with different ways of dealing with race on campus. And I decided to focus on college admissions because, in some ways, this is sort of the ultimate competition that these young people have just entered into and kind of won because they're going to these Ivy League universities, right? So they've just been rewarded through this system, right? But they also know that the outcome of those competitions is highly unequal, right? Students, and I'll show you that. So I'll show you this in a second. We know that, and this is very, this gets advertised in campus newspapers and national newspapers. So for example, the first two columns here are percentage of students at Harvard and Brown that are Black and Latino, so about 15%, compared to overall young people in the same age category are 34% Black or Latino, so more than twice. And so, pretty serious underrepresentation of Black and Latino students, and also class. So among adults in the United States, about a third of adults in the United States have a bachelor's degree. But the parents of students at these universities are very different. 85% of them have a parent who has a bachelor's degree, right? And so, the outcome of the admissions process is highly unequal, right? And the students recognize it. So how do they grapple with these two kind of pieces of information? The same is true at Oxford. So the two biggest minority groups in Britain are Black Britons and South Asian, or British Asians, sometimes the phrase they use. 7% of students at Oxford are British, Black, or South Asian students, compared to young adults in Britain are 14%. So again, half. In terms of one of the measure that is often used in Britain for the marker of class is private school graduates. And about 7% of British youth attend private schools, whereas almost half of students at Oxford come from private schools. And this is true at Cambridge as well, though sometimes people call it Oxbridge to signify Oxford and Cambridge at the same time. So again, we know that the outcomes are unequal. But we also know that students the admissions rates are very low, right? In the US, they're now under 10%. They're declining in Britain as well. And so, excuse me, students, whether they've gone to a low-performing urban high school or, the most elite boarding school, most of their peers are not getting into Harvard and Brown, right? So there's a sense of, and they've probably most of them have worked very hard in high school, right? So how do they reconcile that and that sense of accomplishment when they get that admissions letter with these outcomes and this inequality? So, what are the implications of that meaning making, especially coupled with diversity-related university policies and practices? I talk a lot more about this in the book, about kind of race relations on campus in both of these national contexts. And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A, but I don't think I'm probably not going to talk as much about that today in the talk. Okay, so what might we expect in terms of how students make sense of admissions? We might take what some people call a symbolic politics approach. And so symbolic politics says that when people vote, we don't vote according to our kind of material conditions and our self-interests, but rather we vote according to our identities or symbolic meaning or kind of cultural identities, right? So there's for example, there's the book, What's the Matter with Kansas, right, with Thomas Frank, who says, well, why is it that working class people in Kansas are voting for the Republican Party when that party is not in their own kind of self-interest? And symbolic politics explains that by saying that it's not about your own self-interest, it's about your identity, right? And so identities might shape students' views. And so, and this is in contrast to kind of self-interest. And, you know, I think college admissions especially is it's very much in the public domain, especially admissions to places like Harvard, right? It's talked about affirmative action, and everyone has an opinion on affirmative action. It's on a lot of national polls. This is something that is part of kind of the political domain. And so, you know, we might think that students express critiques in line with their political identities. Right. So this is just showing you that, you know, newspapers are kind of obsessed with these universities, kind of, you know, strangely so. So this is an article from The Guardian, one of the national newspapers in Britain, talking about Oxbridge admissions. Here's one from the Washington Post that was from a few weeks ago when the college rankings came out. Here's one about, you know, every year there's an article about, you know, that student that gets into all 8 Ivy League universities. Here's something from the BBC about Oxbridge admissions. So, you know, we might expect a liberal critique. We know that residential college students are at an age in which people tend to be more liberal than others. College students tend to be more liberal than other people their age. And through being in a residential college, people tend to get more liberal over time, right? So there is a kind of a prevailing liberal identity. And critique is critique and even protest is very endemic to kind of the college experience. Students, residential college experience especially, students are at an age in which they're kind of primed to reject what the kind of authorities are doing. They're, you know, when you're kind of leaving home for a college experience, you're making a break from previous identities, forming new identities. There's a lot of research on this and why there's increased kind of protest movement in college, right? And this is often a liberal critique. And, you know, in the U.S., this might mean that students say, well, we need more class and race diversity. It's pretty kind of hard to argue with that, given what we saw earlier in terms of the outcomes of admissions. And in Britain, you know, class is much more kind of on the public's, it is talked a lot more about in Britain. So students might say we need more class diversity. Race, much more recently, has been talked about in Britain. So perhaps some students might say that, yeah, we need more racial diversity. And there are very few, especially Black British students on these campuses. On the other hand, there might be a small but vocal minority who express a kind of conservative critique. You know, there's a great book, if you're interested, about campus conservatives in the United States called Becoming Right by Amy Binder, where she's talking about these conservative campus organizations and how they kind of express protest. And in the U.S., the most obvious thing that they might say is, well, we got to end affirmative action, right? Perhaps some of them might say, we need to make it class-based, not race-based, right? And we hear that critique a lot. In Britain, you know, it's already, I'll talk about admissions in a second, but basically in Britain there's an exam and there's the interview. But perhaps there might be a kind of cultural conservatives who say we should base this on the interview and have people who can kind of express a kind of cultural knowledge, or perhaps others will say, no, we need like a pure meritocracy and make this only exam-based. But it's already a kind of somewhat conservative system. Okay, so that's the kind of critique. On the other hand, we might expect students to engage in what we might call status legitimation. They might reproduce the admissions policies to their universities, right? Because they want to legitimate the status that they have just achieved by, like, I just worked hard in high school. I got into Harvard. I'm not going to say that that's an unfair system, right? I want to believe that that means that I am highly accomplished, right? So, so that's a kind of self-interest story, right, in contrast to the symbolic politics. And this means that students will basically talk about admissions and what's fair in the ways that their universities talk about it, and which is very different in the United States and Britain. So they'll express these kind of nation-specific understandings. And this will mean that they think that their system is a fair system. Excuse me. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about what I did. So this is, I mentioned the study of students at Harvard, Brown, and Oxford, and this is mostly based on student interviews and a pre-interview survey. I had a conversation with the Harvard Dean of Admissions. I read a lot about, he has a lot of stuff published online. Their websites have a lot of information that's very telling. I interviewed the head of admissions at Oxford. I also interviewed students of color in the U.S. and immigrant second generation, so UK-born children of immigrants from outside the EU in Britain. I'm going to focus on the white students for today, and I'm happy to talk about the students of color and the second generation students in the Q&A if people are interested. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about admissions to elite universities. Most of you probably know how college admissions works in the U.S. Lots of information, the essay, SAT, your GPA, teacher recommendations. The Harvard Dean of Admissions talks about an expansive view of excellence, extracurricular distinction and personal qualities, and diversity. And in Britain, students first take the national exams, and through that, you kind of know what grades you need to have even have a chance of getting into Oxford or Cambridge. And if you have, the grades, you apply, and then you apply to a particular subject. So, if you want to study history, you apply to the history department. And different departments have different entrance exams. Some of them have entrance exams. Sometimes you see in a portfolio. And then, on the basis of that, students, some students get invited to an on-campus interview. And this interview is with an academic in your field of study. So this is someone who's going to be your professor. So very different kind of system where in the U.S., we have these kind of expansive admissions offices that are making decisions. And in Britain, they're really done by the actual faculty. The website talks about academic abilities, aptitude for your subject. Oops, I'll go back. Okay, I'm not going to go back. I'm just going to read you a quote from the Oxford Director of Undergraduate Admissions. He said, he's talking about students who are studying for math. He said, we're taking students who really only need to be really good at mathematics. It doesn't really matter whether they've got any social skills or have any interest in liberal arts or humanities or whatever, as long as they're good mathematicians. So very different from how we think about admissions in the United States. Okay, so I'm going to start with students in the United States and what I found. So the first thing to notice about U.S. students is that they talk about calibrating admission evaluations according to individual merit, according to life circumstances. So this is a good thing. This means that students are recognizing that there are unequal opportunities for kids in American society, and admissions officers should take that into account, right? So if you go to a high school that offers just one AP class, you take that class and you do well, then that's better than someone who's taken 2 at a high school that offered 10, right? Because you've taken full advantage of whatever opportunities you've had. Here's a student who says, if you had a very hard life, but you did, let's say you got A's and B's instead of straight A's, but you had to work like 20 extra hours a week than another kid. And I think that speaks a lot more than if you got straight A's, because you had to provide for your family or help provide for them. So I think it should be taken into account. And given this sort of need for calibration, how they think about calibration also varied according to how they thought about the role of race in society. So in the book, I have a chapter where I talk about students' race frames, how they understand what race does in society. And that affected whether or not they thought that we should calibrate according to race and racial background. For example, students who had a colorblind view of race, that is that race, we're a kind of post-racial society, race doesn't matter anymore, said that we shouldn't be calibrating by race because it's just, race matters only in as much as it coincides with class. So the student says, I think they should consider socioeconomic background and the difficulties that people have. If you're from the same situation or background, you face the same problems. Like if a white kid had the same kind of upbringing with parents with the same income level as a black kid, I don't think the black kid should have an advantage over me if we both came from the same background. in contrast, there were students who, a minority of students, very small number of white students, some, but very small number of white students had what I call a power analysis frame. That is, that understood race to be something that structures inequality and racial groups to be unequal, have unequal status and power in society. And these students understood that race plays a distinct role from class in American society. And so they said, yeah, you should calibrate by race as well. This was more common among students of color, although not among all students of color either. So that's calibration. The second piece is that students talked about what I call the collective merit of the cohort. And this is this, that we all have different talents, different perspectives, different things that we bring to our cohort. And together we make this collective that really enriches everybody's college experience. And so everyone has to bring something to the table. Everyone has a hook that leads to a better kind of collective. And so one student is talking about athletics. We asked, all kinds of questions. One of the questions was, should college consider athletics and admissions? And the student says, I used to think that having athletes who are, quote unquote, less qualified, I no longer view them as less qualified. I view them as qualified in a different way. This was even true of legacies. Legacy admissions is this practice by which people whose parents have gone to a particular college get a leg up in admissions, right? With the idea that that boosts contributions, financial contributions. So this student says that, and I was surprised that about half of students agree with legacy admissions. And this student says, given that people who went to Harvard are much more likely to donate to the university and continue donating to the university if their children go to Harvard, I think that's a reason to advantage them in admissions. And I remember Harvard, in particular, has $30 billion now. So the extent to which we really need that money, I don't know. But there is this sense of, this idea that everyone's bringing something. Someone's bringing money, someone's bringing athletics. Now, under this logic, race becomes a thing to contribute to the cohort. And it becomes a kind of there's a kind of commodification of racial identities through this logic. So this student says, ethnic diversity adds as much to the class as somebody who's a world-class piano player, and it's just a different sort of diversity to add. And so this rests on this idea that racial diversity is important for the college experience, right? But you can see how this kind of can be a problematic way of seeing peers who are, in particular, Black and Latino, on campus as a sort of, they're bringing their Blackness or their Latino-ness to campus. And it rests on the diversity frame, which is the third big racial frame that I talked about, which is that seeing race as structuring our kind of ways of understanding the world and something that we should celebrate and pay attention to. So, okay, and so then when we couple this with the diversity racial frame, it leads to support for affirmative action. And this was the most common way that students said that they support affirmative action. So we asked students, should admissions consider race in decision making? And most students said yes, because it contributes to the diversity of the cohort, right? Because it creates this diverse learning environment, and that's a good thing. And so let me just say that both of these aspects, the calibration and collective merit, have downstream consequences for race relations on campus. And I kind of go through that in the book. And I just want to highlight two today. So one is the diversity bargain, the title of the book, which is this, that white students support affirmative action in as much as it benefits themselves. And through this kind of diverse learning environment, right? And as opposed to, other justifications like having a diverse leadership or to address inequality or reparations. It's really about benefits to dominant groups. But this leads to three kind of problematic outcomes. One is the integration imperative, which is that white students expect their Black and Latino students to integrate, right? Because that's the bargain, right? You get a kind of leg up in admissions, but I need to benefit from your perspective. And so, let's see, should I go through this one? Okay, I'm going to skip that. But, you can see students critique, we heard a lot of students critiquing, well, we come here and this is what we're supposed to do, but then I see a table of Black students sitting over there and that kind of upsets me, right? Without a kind of recognition of why those students might need that space. Yeah?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Does that mean that the white students think that it has to come from the Black students, or do they see it 50-50 as a shared responsibility? I could go over there and sit with them or ask them to. Yeah,
I think the problem is that they don't realize, they don't notice the table of white students, or that, like, whose responsibility is it, right? And I think they place the onus on the students of color. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I talk about that in the book, right? That who is segregated from who, and whose responsibility is this? But again, if you think of this as, this is the diversity bargain, then it's those students' responsibility, right, under this logic. The second thing is the reverse discrimination script, right? This idea that, okay, affirmative action is fine as long as it benefits me, and when it doesn't benefit me, it's going too far. So here's a student who said that if I hadn't gone into Harvard, I would have felt I'd been discriminated against. As someone else I knew who was equally qualified and who was a minority, they'd gotten in over me. And I call this a script because it's kind of a script for making sense of the world. This student got into Harvard, but still has that anxiety in the back of his head. And imagine now, later on, he goes to apply for an internship or a job and doesn't get it. It's easy to blame affirmative action for not getting those, for not winning those competitive processes. And then it doesn't make sense to him because this was supposed to benefit me. And the third is a kind of essentialized conceptions of race or ethnicity, right? So if the idea is that you bring these different perspectives, then there's an expectation that, first there's an assumption that all Black and Latino students have benefited from affirmative action, when in fact we know that, many of the Black and Latino students on campus would have gotten in regardless, but that there is a particular kind of experience. So this student said, I don't think that because someone checked the Black box or, the Latino box, that should be what gets them in. Maybe in their interview you find that, like, since they're Latino, they've done all these things that make them add something different to the cultural fabric of Harvard. I know people who are like a quarter Mexican who got the Latino Scholars Award, and their entire experience has been a white experience. Right, so this student is defining what it means to be white and what it means to be Latino, and saying this student doesn't qualify with from my version of what it means to be Latino, rather than expanding her understanding of what that is. And it's about contributing to this kind of cultural fabric of Harvard, right? And that's the expectation. And so this diversity bargain is really embedded in students' understandings of merit. And I'll talk in a moment about the British diversity bargain. But the last thing I want to say about the US students, because it'll have implications for the British students, is there's also this kind of interesting kind of peer evaluation that's going on, right? Because there's sort of this collective merit, they're kind of looking at their peers and wondering, like, well, what got you in, and what got you in, and what's your thing, right, that you brought to the cohort? And they're questioning some of their Black and Latino peers, right? So this student, or peers who might be an athlete. The student says, in class, one kid said, "You don't want us to have to use MLA or nothing like that." And the first thing that popped in my head was, "Oh, he must be an athlete." Right. And this could be racially coded language from the kind of grammar structure that she uses. We don't know, but there is this sort of like looking for clues about their peers in a way that can be kind of harmful on campus. Okay, so let me turn now to the British case. The British case, in some ways, is a lot less complex than the U.S. case. Students had very standard, simple criteria based on individuals. The student said, ultimately, we should just be blank faces. We should just all be admitted totally on merit. So there was no kind of desire for calibration in Britain, right? Just, blank face, whatever you get on the test, great. And this was true, surprisingly, for students who are from non-traditional backgrounds as well. So this is a student who went to a public means private, to a state school, a public school, what we would call a public school, that was a kind of low-performing public school. And the student says, I think it should be very much based on merit rather than on background. Personally, if I knew that I'd been positively discriminated for being from a state comprehensive school, I think when I came here, I would find it a lot more difficult because I would feel that I hadn't earned my place to be here. Right, so there's a real kind of different way of thinking about background and whether background should be part of that evaluation. Another student said, you get to Oxford as a result of your education. No matter how naturally brilliant you are, you have to be well educated. And the wealth distribution in society means that sorry, I should have said this before. This is a response to a question about underrepresentation of black students on campus. And he says, the wealth distribution in society means that white people have more access to the best education, even in the state sector. The state schools are of lower quality, in my belief, in areas of greater ethnic density. This student attended a really top, well-known British boarding school before coming to Oxford. And so, but this idea that, okay, you could have a kind of, natural or innate intelligence, but you have to be kind of groomed, and that has to be cultivated in these elite spaces. And that schools are unequal, and so there's a recognition of inequality, but saying that that exists, but, you'll see that that's not the university's responsibility. This student says, from my experience, excuse me, the people that are admitted are based on how good they are rather than where they're from. So notice that language and that logic, how good they are, and rather than where they're from. But I think it's about 50% go to a private school who come here, but only about 3%, it's actually 7%. Student says 3% of people in England go to a private school. So it is a meritocracy, but that meritocracy might be to do with the upbringing of the child, right? And again, a different understanding of what, where merit lies, and how do we measure that, and how do we, the extent to which we take into consideration opportunities. This student says, Oxford has a very clear stated aim, and that is to maintain its position in an intellectual society. There's a real sense of a different, okay, now I think my voice is done. Different role that the university plays in society, right? That this is a kind of city on a hill, it has this role, and it can't be bothered with, what's happening and this inequality in K-12 education. And so that it's not going to play the same role, right? And so overall, these UK students had very different understandings of merit. Obviously no sense of collective merit either, or calibration, to the US students. But what they share with US students is that they basically reproduce and agree with the way that admissions happens in their own university, right? And just like the American students basically said what their admissions offices said, these British students are saying what their admissions office is saying as well. So they don't really critique what their university does. Now, the British diversity bargain is this: that white British students accept their peers as intellectual equals in exchange for, and there's two things. So remember, in the US, there are these evaluations going on that I was talking about. They didn't see the same thing in Britain. But there is a cost to this, a pretty severe cost, and as I talk about it. First, there's almost no vision for increasing equity in admissions outcomes. One student put it simply, and I think pretty succinctly, underrepresentation is a problem, but it's not Oxford's problem, right? It's a problem, the government's got to fix this. Now remember, these universities are public universities in the UK, publicly funded, and so, but it's seen as kind of outside the purview of higher education. Here's a student who said, I've had friends at Oxford who have come here and frankly not been bright enough, and have struggled and had a miserable time. I don't think that's fair. It's miserable being in Oxford if you're not good enough. Oxford isn't the kind of place where your tutor is going to spend extra time teaching you. the tutorial system in Britain is where you have lectures and then you have one-on-one or two-on-one tutorial sessions with a professor or a TF, postdoc, and every week. And so in some ways you would think that this is a kind of conducive to supporting kind of non-traditional students. But this idea is that, like, well, the tutor's not going to take you on, like, that's not their job. Oxford isn't the kind of place where your tutor is going to spend extra time teaching you. And if Oxford tutors aren't prepared to take on the responsibility of getting the people up to scratch, then it's not fair to anyone. So again, this idea that this is what the university is, this is who it's designed to teach, and it is what it is, right? And then we shouldn't, rather than expecting that identifying that as the problem, students identify the problem lower down the line, that it's the K-12 system. The same student then goes on and says, the responsibility, in my opinion, lies with the primary schools or the secondary schools. That's where the problem is, not at this level. So, lack of vision for any role that the university might play in addressing inequality. The second piece of the British diversity bargain is that there's a real denial of the experiences of minority peers. I'll just show you, I don't know if people heard about the I Too Am Harvard campaign. It kind of went viral. I don't know if it was here at UNC. This was like a year or two ago. But this was a campaign where black students at Harvard, it was a photo campaign where they kind of held up placards and wrote responses to kind of microaggressions that they had experienced. And a few weeks later, Oxford students came out with I Too Am Oxford. And this young woman says, she's quoting somebody, wow, your English is great. And then she responds, thanks, I was born in London. And then she's hashtag unimpressed. So they had this photo campaign. And at Harvard, so I Too Am Harvard came out, the president wrote this piece. She wrote she in the Boston Globe, she in the Harvard newspaper. There was an event. The dean of students came out very much supportive of the students and said, we need to do better. There's actually just a few days ago was announced there's a task force on inclusion that's happening at Harvard. So a real kind of university response that we need to do something about this, that our students are feeling excluded. At Oxford, a few days later, this came out, We Are All Oxford. And it was a response saying, you know what, those guys are just whiners. Look, she says, we enjoyed celebrating diversity at the Oxford University Student Union International Fair, right? And there was an interview with the student, I think she's the one who started this campaign, and she basically said, I felt like they were giving us a bad rep, and actually it's really good here, like, what are they complaining about? And there was no institutional response here, so very different kind of place. And really what this does, it provides a denial of the experiences of minority peers, and a kind of shutting down when students do say, like, this is hard for me, or this is what's happened to me. And here's a student, and again, this is not a kind of outlier view. This student says, I'm slightly irritable when it comes to people crying wolf. And by that I mean doing what they do best, which is, playing the race card, saying, is it because I'm black? That really annoys me because it's so unfounded in England. It's so untrue. You see racism so much in other countries, which we don't have here. Again, that language is very strong, and it's very much, she's saying, my peers are saying this, and that's wrong, right? There's a real denial of what they're saying. And, I heard this also in the kind of culture of racial jokes. And, that this was sort of just part of, like, the banter, the kind of private school, boys banter. And when students said that they, the very small minority students who said that they did try to kind of step in and say, hey, that's kind of offended by that, or why are you saying that they were just shut down, right? That there's no space to kind of express that critique, or people reject the critique, right? And that's, because there is this view that just, this is the way the university is, this is our culture, either you assimilate or you shouldn't be here. So, and I talk in the book a little bit more about the kind of experiences on campus as well. Okay, so overall, I see the strong evidence of this status legitimation. Students are reproducing the admissions process to their respective campuses. They really reproduce the language of their administrators. I do in the book, I compare some of the language that students are using and what I see online or from interviews with admissions people, it's really uncanny how similar they are. So they embrace this process that they know to have unequal results and outcomes, in which disadvantaged groups are underrepresented. They think their system is the best, most fair one, and that brings the most deserving students to campus. And of course, the underlying assumption, or the follow-on to that, is that people who didn't make it are not as deserving as they are, right? And, you know, on the one hand, you know, I started this out kind of thinking that, well, all this public discussion about inequality in admissions must make people question it a little bit. But it actually might be the case that status legitimation might be exacerbated, not attenuated, by public discussions of inequality in admissions. So Mary Jackman, in this kind of classic book called The Velvet Glove, talks about how elites, when elites want to maintain their status, and it's easy to maintain your status when people just sort of don't call it into question. But when your status is called into question, you might work even harder to maintain that position and defend that position and defend the legitimacy of that position and of that system. And so overall, these students are really engaging in this, you know, what I call this ultra-meritocracy. And this ultra-meritocracy kind of fuels this legitimation, right? Joseph Suarez wrote this book about Oxford University, and he talks about how, you know, the admissions is increasingly competitive. And through that, it kind of fuels this idea that it's a fair system, right? Every year the campus paper publishes admissions rate as an all-time low, or, you know, and this is true of this is, you know, a lot of universities. I'm sure many of your universities have do this as well, and that they suggest that you know, the students come to campus and they say you're the best class ever, you know, the strongest class ever, and so there's this idea that this, you know, increasing competition and decreasing admit rates fuels this idea that this is an even stronger meritocracy. But in fact, we know that the more exclusive these universities become, the more unequal their outcomes actually become, right? And so, but of course, students don't see that. And the universities as well play a role in this legitimation through these mechanisms that I just talked about. Their status is also at stake. They want students to believe that they're the best of the best, and this is the best university in the world, and, you know, yada yada. And so they have an interest in reproducing this logic, students reproducing this logic as well. And so overall, I'm not going to talk about the policy feedback loop. So overall, we might see self-interest over symbolic politics. You know, I started out saying, well, maybe students will express critiques, or maybe they'll just reproduce what the universities say. It might be that when status is at stake, we see a lot more self-interest, right? So, and there's a significant investment in the system of reward. So, you know, these students have worked incredibly hard in high school, right, to get into these universities, right? What they don't realize is that a lot of other people worked really hard, didn't get into those universities. Some people didn't have the resources or the opportunities to work hard and to enter into that competition or to go to that school that was going to challenge them in that way. But they don't see that, right? They see that, okay, I worked hard, and so that this is a fair system, and I've invested so much in this system. How could I not believe that it's a fair system? And so overall, let me just close by saying that I see this work as illuminating how these systems of reward are not just about the rewards they mete out, right? So admissions is not just about, okay, how do we select students? It also shapes and reflects individuals' meaning making in other domains, right? So, you know, so one of these is the role of race in society, and how we think about what does it mean to be a fair system? What's, you know, equity? All of these things are embedded in admissions, and these are part, you know, we need to think about the kind of implications of how we talk about these issues for students' meaning making. And they're going to take that meaning making and go on in the future when they make decisions about hiring, about, you know, if they become policymakers, about, you know, the welfare state, about, you know, how they're going to vote. Like, these things actually matter for what they're going to do in the future, right? And we don't normally think about that when we think about these systems within universities or any kinds of institutions. So let me stop there, and I'll look forward to your questions. Yeah.